Nutrition misinformation is really common, much more common than people might realize. And with social media being a key way that many people are accessing health information now, it becomes even easier to provide information, but also with that, even easier to provide misinformation online. So, why is this an issue anyway? Well, nutrition misinformation can cause more difficulties than we realize, especially when it comes to our health, because it can often change the way that we're thinking about our health, actually make changes with not just our diet, but in other parts of our health as well. And that can then, the risk is that that could potentially lead to harm. Now, it is a big concern because you're not getting accurate information, which is especially what you're looking for when you're looking for information, especially around nutrition. This may include incorrect facts, may include different dietary practices that are actually incorrect or they're giving you wrong information about them, and also perhaps even giving you false information around the potential health benefits. And this can give you a lot of confusion. Now, online, the nutrition and dietetics field often lacks stringent regulatory oversight, and it allows people without proper qualifications to be able to share misleading or harmful information. Now, it's not so straightforward as we think. This is not simply a case of have you got the right qualification, because many people don't have certain qualifications but may still be giving good information. But conversely, people with qualifications may also be misleading you as well. So while a qualification is helpful, it may not be everything. Often people are promoting a hidden agenda, whether it's a fad diet or whether it's a specific product or a supplement, and this can be confusing. And different things can lead to sort of other things like disordered eating or yo-yo dieting. And I know that you're seeing conflicting messages online. We all are. Now, some of these conflicting messages are right because the way in which you portray information will be conflicting. But for many people who are giving out the information, they're specifically giving you specific black and white answers, which are saying that this is the only correct approach, and what other way you're seeing is not the correct approach. And that then becomes more confusing because then another person will, with a completely contrasting and conflicting piece of information, will tell you that exact the same thing as well. Nutrition information and misinformation can also support the exploitation of fear and trends online. So when people exploit your fear around your health and well-being, this can then lead to the sale and promotion of products to try and allay those fears. This can overall, or this may well be because of the scale of this issue, having a big impact on public health. It may also lead to increased barriers against using evidence base as a practice to getting your best information. And social media influencers, people who have big followings, get good reach. And because of the followings, people often are more likely to trust the information that they're getting from them. So, what's the evidence that this is really a problem? Well, there is an article written by Zoe Loft, who is a nutritional researcher in human nutrition and a PhD candidate in Canada. And she has talked about this issue specifically in Canada. Now, some of the things that she's talked about include the fact that in a 5 year period, 40% of the most frequently shared links contained fake news, which was shared nearly 500,000 times online, and that dietary plans may encourage you to believe that the answer is simple and that the science is streamlined, when in reality it's not. And in Canada, almost 6 in 10 Canadians under 35 use the internet to keep up to date on health research and news. Some of the key points that she made is around misinformation, but she also talked about something called the heuristic systematic model. Scientific term, but essentially this relates to how people process information differently based on their prior knowledge. So when people lack an expertise in a certain subject, you're more likely to be persuaded by a specific viewpoint, and you may have to rely on superficial cues such as the attractiveness of a presentation of the information rather than its actual quality. And Zoe's also talked about the influence of credibility as the aesthetic appeal and personal brand rather than scientific credentials. And that perceived authority can lead to followers or people who look at that content to emulate their diets and lifestyles without really evaluating whether that's right for them, whether it is actually a right approach generally. Now, these social media places can also become echo chambers. Social media algorithms are set up to feed us the information that we want to see, which means that it selectively exposes us to stuff that we're already seeing, which means that we are going to be entering echo chambers. So despite there being lots and lots of information online, what you're seeing online is going to be very different to what someone else is seeing online. And as you get more and more exposure to something, that then challenges your quality evaluation in your own mind, and it makes you think that that's more likely to be true. So there's some interesting studies where simply just being exposed to something will actually lead to you be believing it, more likely to believe it, even if initially you didn't believe it. So repeated exposure is a concern. And then, of course, there's this lack of regulation that she's noticed too. So why is it difficult to understand nutrition? Well, I think there's some real practicalities around the fact that human biology is complex. There are millions, billions of us in the world, and we're all individually different. And there are multiple things at play. And we're often not just thinking about nutrition, we've also got to think about exercise, well-being, sleep, stress, and they're all interlinked. That's the lifestyle factors, but then we've got to look at the environment, where you're living, how that impacts your genetics, your parents' genetics, perhaps even your grandparents' genetics, and the epigenetics, which is around the genetic expression, and then a high degree of luck. And luck essentially is a lot of it is science that is unexplained still. So there's a ton of stuff that's going on. And so while it's a science, it's kind of an art form in sort of delivering good healthcare, but then providing information around it isn't easy because we tend to, as human beings, take on information that's clear, succinct, and more black and white. But without nuance and context, we can't really understand information to that much detail. Is essentially if something is too good to be true or sounds too good to be true, it is likely to be too good to be true. Now, that's not always the case. There might be new exciting things that happen, but if something is bucking the trend in terms of the way it's providing information, you've got to have a real air of suspicion around that. And conflicting information is confusing for people. It makes people frustrated, I believe, because they just don't know what is the right way to achieve certain things. And the interesting thing about conflicting information is that there may not be one way of achieving what you're trying to achieve. There are diverse dietary patterns across the world. You know, culture has a big, big impact on what's going to be practical for you. If there was, let's just say hypothetically, there was one perfect diet for every single human being to follow, which we know there isn't. But if there was, then we'd have to put that into the cultural context of each culture, each other aspects, the weather, the environment, what the people are doing around you. If everyone else is doing something entirely different to you or the foods aren't available to you, then even that wouldn't be possible for you. So all of these are compounding together. Nutrients interact with each other. So just saying eating one food or eating this food doesn't apply to whole food groups. And ultimately, our health is dictated by long-term patterns of eating over years of eating in certain different ways, not by days or even weeks. It takes sometimes even decades for certain conditions to develop when it's related to food. And then we've got a lot of biases at play. Food is related to wealth in terms of getting sales and in terms of people's businesses, whether that's big food industry, whether it's smaller social media influencers, the whole lot is influenced by money and people's specific wants and underlying drivers. So you've got to put that into mind as well. That means that lots of things are being marketed falsely, even where they're being regulated, for example, with big food industry. We may also think about examples that come straight to us to prove that what we already think to know is true. So immediate examples that come to mind will help to reinforce the way that we're thinking, but those examples may not necessarily be representative of a full picture. I think there's some other things around overgeneralization and anecdotal evidence, which we see. So people say, what I do in a day, what I believe to be true, what worked for me. And even as health professionals, we've got to be careful that what worked for me or what worked for my partner or what for my friends isn't necessarily what's right for my patients. What's right for my patients is looking at the evidence base, looking at the person in front of me and trying to personalize that information to them. And we have to think critically when looking at data. And another really, really big thing is really understanding statistics. And I think statistics are actually really difficult to understand. We get training within medical schools on understanding medical statistics, but also um, we don't probably get enough of it. And when people then have to do dissertations in their masters or in PhDs, that's when their knowledge of statistics tend to rise even further. But statistics is a really, really key thing because we can manipulate statistics, and all different ways of manipulating the statistics can still remain true. And that will appeal to different people, and that may change decision making. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But let's look at in the UK, the British Dietetic Association. So they've recognised that there is a big issue in terms of nutrition misinformation, and they've launched a few initiatives around it. And in 2020, they launched the Ads and Fads campaign, which was a campaign to try and correct misleading information shared online in the media and on social media platforms. Um, Now, they're in the UK, they are regulated by law and governed by an ethical code, and they essentially, the BDA emphasises the importance of promoting responsible, evidence-based advice and targeting unsubstantiated claims that confuse and mislead the public. In terms of social media engagement, the BDA does have a responsibility in monitoring people who are members of the BDA, typically dietitians, and checking inaccurate information if that's flagged to them. And while they may not always respond publicly, the BDA does monitor this and will work with its members to make sure that they try and follow the policy effectively. Now, the BDA also offers evidence-based resources to counteract misinformation. So they have a food facts diet sheet, which may help people to try and make better informed dietary choices. Um, so that's the BDA, but then we've also got the Association for Nutrition. Now, I always think critically about anything, including this. So the AFN have tried to also provide some good information on 5 top tips for avoiding nutrition misinformation. And so their 5 top tips are: 1, trust your inner skeptic. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Number 2, check the credibility of the source. So who is the author? What have they done before? What are their qualifications? How do they create their information? Do they have a registered post-nominals after them? And where are they quoting that information from? This is really difficult if you're not specifically trained in this, but by having an air of suspicion, you can start to think, is this really, really true? And then perhaps you might want to just look at and getting information from another source too. Even if it's a reputable source, you may still want to get information from another source. I think that should become a really standard habit for most people. Number 3, try and eliminate advice from your inbox and news feeds that recommend to avoid foods or food groups. For some people, that might feel controversial, but essentially, I think we're looking towards the personalization effect of this, which is that if you're just telling anyone to eliminate whole food groups, that isn't essentially healthy. That could be restricting your food intake, that could be restricting your potential nutrient intake. And if there is one specific thing that's affecting your diet or affecting your health, it's unlikely to be coming from a whole food group. And getting professional advice and trying to get some clear understanding around that is going to be a much better way of trying to manage your health. The key thing about this is that often we're vilifying foods where we shouldn't be putting an emotional aspect on certain foods. Now, even at this point in 2024, we're even thinking about um, not just food groups, we're even thinking about entire food sources of macronutrients. For example, you're hearing online, we've got to cut out carbs completely. And again, we've been eating carbs for thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And we have entire systems at play to try and manage carbs. And we also have insulin, which helps to deal with carbs, and glucose, which is a breakdown of carbs, is our main energy source. So again, cutting out whole food groups, like such as the one that's being talked about at the moment around carbs and macronutrients, isn't necessarily a sensible thing to do. It isn't a sensible thing to do at all. And then fourth, they say no food or supplement can boost your immune system or prevent COVID-19. Now, I think this is difficult. Now, this is where I think even guidelines we should be critical to them. How do we know that there isn't a food or a supplement in the future that will ever boost an immune system? I think what the AFN are getting at here is that this is a very simplistic way of looking at something, breaking something down to one single ingredient and saying that's going to improve your health or that's going to boost your immune system. And the thing about boosting your immune system, what does that even mean? We've got to have an attention to that level of thinking here. And number 5, nutrition and health professionals will not sell supplements. I think this is fascinating because I see lots and lots of adverts on social media for some of the biggest social media influencers across social media, and they are not directly selling products that are maybe supplements or health related, but they are doing adverts for them. And some people may be doing very direct adverts. Some people may be doing adverts as part of a podcast. And for me, all of this is selling. It's selling a supplement, or it's selling a food that has purported health benefits, or maybe better or healthier, or may not have health impacts compared to something else. So I think even the guidelines are clouded, and with these big companies, they're publishing information that is coming from large companies that are likely to be sponsoring them, and some companies look cleaner in inverted commas than others. Does that mean that those companies are correct? And when you look down into the articles, they're not referenced clearly. They're not referenced from scientific articles. So we've got to have an air of suspicion even with big organizations. And I'm of the case where I will look at that information, and just because it's a big organization, it doesn't mean that they're protected from my opinion of, is this correct information? We've got to be careful here, because lots of people can say that the person who's spouting incorrect information, that could be me. So you should have an air of suspicion about me and say, if that person is spouting incorrect information and he's discrediting a big organization, then who's correct? Is he the correct person? Is the organization the correct person? This is where it really comes down to being able to read papers and being able to make up decisions. Ultimately, many people might be right about the same fact with different viewpoints. It comes down to that granularity of frustration in a way. Now, I mentioned that there'd be some potential common biases in statistics. One of them is around relativity. So, for example, a nice example of that is thinking around being thinking about surgery. So, in surgery, the person may say to you, "Okay, well, this surgery has a 98% success rate of survival. So you're going to be absolutely fine." It's probably what you're thinking as a consequence. 98%, it's really good odds. Or if I was to flip it and say, this surgery has a 2% mortality rate, 2% death rate, then you might be thinking, well, actually, that's 2 in 100 that could happen to me. So for every 100 operations that people go through for this surgery, 2 people aren't going to survive. And that starts to change the nature of the game. And even if I said 80% chance of an amazing success, you're thinking, okay, that's pretty good. 20% chance of severe disability. Now that's not black and white, so let's just try and make that better. So 80% chance of success, or 20% chance it doesn't work. A 1 in 5 chance that it doesn't work is actually much bigger than what you might feel. So that's a relativity example. A choice overload is another potential issue is that by having too many choices, it becomes too hard for the mind to make up a decision. So then coming down to, say, for example, just two choices of taking a diet plan. Shall I have no carbs or shall I have no fat in my diet? That's a very simple choice that people can make, but it's not necessarily and not the right approach to health, for example. We've got to recognize that although nutrition is complex, it doesn't need to be complicated. So it is complex. There's lots of things going on, but we can understand that in a little bit um, in a more simplified way, but not to the point where it's going to lead to a lack of nutrients or to completely cut out food groups, which could be potentially harmful for your health. Another one is social proof. If people are all starting to jump onto the next thing, you're going to do that, or more likely to do that as well. We want to feel part of the in crowd. So whether or not we realize it, there is sometimes some bias, which we may or may not be aware of, some subconscious or conscious bias. And this also comes into status and self-image. When we think about clean eating, or we think about someone going for their yoga class, for example, we might think of them also having a green juice or eating very healthy. But we wouldn't imagine someone going to a yoga class and then going straight into McDonald's, would we? Or walking out of McDonald's into a yoga class. And that's a lot about status and self-image. And sometimes these correlations can be healthy for us. Eating healthier and doing a bit of exercise is a nice combination to have together. So that's just a fair bit of information around nutrition and misinformation. And if you're more confused, I apologize. I think the key thing here is to have an air of suspicion of anything you're listening to. Look at the sources. This is my view anyway. Look at the sources. Look who's written it. Look at their other information. Do they criticize themselves? Do they backtrack on information that they've provided, say, 2 years ago, and say, actually, this is my update on this information? Do they back up the information that they're providing with lots of sources? And do they recognize where they could have some biases in their information? All of that is really, really important. And if you can get information that's being given by different professionals from different spheres, and they're giving you similar advice, I think that is quite powerful to understand if that information is correct for you. And doing your own research, taking information, researching it yourself, and even questioning information. Is that really correct? What about the evolving nature of information? Nutritional science isn't set, it's constantly evolving. We're constantly learning more information. And another point on nutrition science is how we look at information. There's different types of studies out there, and that can also give us different perspectives. So that's probably a time for another conversation on the different perspectives of different types of studies that can be done and how we should read them. Well, I hope you had enjoyed today's session, and we'll check in with you soon.